Imagine you're flying a big passenger jet with almost 300 people on board. Everything is normal, you are cruising high above the United States, and then suddenly, bang! The whole airplane shakes. Something has exploded in the tail. Now, losing an engine is obviously serious, but it is not automatically a disaster. Passenger planes are built to survive engine failures. So the pilots start doing what they were trained to do. They identify the failed engine, they begin the checklist, and then the first officer tries to control the airplane. Nothing happens. He moves the controls again, but still nothing. The airplane starts slowly turning to the right and dropping. So the captain grabs the controls himself. Same thing, nothing. And then they look at the hydraulic gauges. System 1, 0. System 2, 0. System 3, 0. And that is when this stops being an engine problem, because now they have much bigger question. How do you fly an airplane when the controls no longer control anything? This was United Airlines Flight 232, July 19th, 1989. A DC-10 flying from Denver toward Chicago with 285 passengers and 11 crew members on board. The first part of the flight had been completely normal. Then, about an hour after takeoff, the tail-mounted engine failed violently. Now the DC-10 had 3 hydraulic systems, and hydraulics are basically the muscles of a big airplane. When the pilot moves the control wheel or pedals, he is not physically pulling huge wings around with cables like on a tiny airplane. Hydraulic pressure moves the important control surfaces, the rudder, the elevators, the ailerons. That is how you point the airplane where you want it to go. So having 3 systems sounds pretty safe. Lose one, well, you still have others. Even losing 2 would be extremely serious, but you still have something left. Flight 232 lost all 3 at once. And the crew did try the obvious things. They deployed an emergency air-driven generator that could power an auxiliary hydraulic pump. Nothing came back. There simply was no hydraulic fluid left where they needed it. So the normal controls were basically useless. At this point, the airplane is still in the sky. The engines on the left and right wings are still working. But the crew cannot properly turn. They cannot properly raise or lower the nose. They cannot fly the airplane in the normal sense of the word. And then they notice something. When the captain reduces power on the left engine, the airplane begins rolling back toward level flight. Okay, that is interesting, because the flight controls may be gone, but the engines are still pushing the airplane, right? So what if they use the engines themselves to steer? Think of it like trying to steer a shopping cart without touching the handle. If you could somehow push harder on the left side, maybe the cart would turn right. Push harder on the right, maybe it turns left. That is basically what they started doing with the DC-10. More power on one engine, less on the other. Wait for the airplane to respond. Then correct again. It was incredibly crude. You move the throttles now, and the airplane reacts a few seconds later. Maybe too much, maybe not enough. And while you are fixing one problem, you are already creating the next one. The FFA later concluded that the airplane was only minimally controllable this way. Simulator tests after the crash showed that successfully landing a DC-10 with all hydraulic flight controls gone was essentially impossible. But then something very lucky happened. There was another DC-10 pilot sitting in the passenger cabin. His name was Dennis Fitch. He was not part of the working crew, he was just traveling as a passenger. But he was also a United Airlines captain and instructor who knew the DC-10 extremely well. So when he heard there was a serious problem, he offered to help. The captain brought him into the cockpit, and Fitch took over the throttles. So now you have 4 experienced pilots in the cockpit trying something none of them had really been trained to do. One man is watching the airplane, another is handling radios and systems, and Fitch is basically flying with 2 engine levers. That is it. No normal steering, no normal pitch control, just power. And somehow, they begin moving toward Sioux City, Iowa. Air traffic control clears everything out of the way. Emergency crews begin preparing at Sioux Gateway Airport. Passengers are told they are going to make an emergency landing, and from the outside, this almost starts looking hopeful. The airplane is still flying, they have found an airport, they are getting closer, maybe they can actually do this. But there is a problem. Getting near a runway is one thing, lining up with it, controlling your speed, controlling how fast you are falling, and touching down gently, that is something completely different. With normal controls, a pilot can make tiny corrections all the way down, a little nose up, a little left, reduce the descent, strengthen the wings. Flight 232 could not do that. Every correction had to come through engine thrust. And engines react slowly, so the crew could guide the airplane toward the airport, but they could never fully tame it. As they came toward the runway, the airplane was descending too fast. It was also beginning to roll. The crew kept working the throttles, trying to hold it together just for a few more seconds. And then the right wing dropped. The airplane hit the ground hard. The wing struck first. The DC-10 broke apart, flipped and burst into flames. Looking at the crash footage, you would expect almost nobody to survive. But of the 296 people on board, 185 survived. The NTSB later described the crew's performance as highly commendable and said it had greatly exceeded reasonable expectations. And now we come back to the question we have avoided so far. How do 3 separate hydraulic systems all disappear because one engine fails? Because that should not really happen, right? That is the whole reason you have 3 systems. Investigators went into the tail and eventually traced everything back to the engine that exploded. Inside that engine was a large titanium fan disc, and hidden inside that disc was a tiny metallurgical defect left from the manufacturing process. Over years of flying, a fatigue crack slowly grew from that defect. Inspection after inspection failed to find it. Until July 19, 1989. That day, the crack finally reached the point where the disc could no longer hold together. The fan disc exploded apart while spinning at enormous speed. And those pieces did not politely stay inside the engine, they blasted outward through the tail. Some of the debris cut through hydraulic lines, one system, then another, then the third. And here is the uncomfortable part. The 3 hydraulic systems were separate in function, but parts of all 3 passed through the same general area in the tail. So one violent event could reach all of them. You know, that is such a simple idea when you hear it afterward. 3 backups sound incredibly safe, but if one piece of debris can physically hit all 3 backups, then they're not as independent as they look on a diagram. And I think that is what makes Flight 232 so interesting. The airplane suffered a failure that the crew was basically never supposed to face. There was no nice checklist saying, okay, all hydraulics gone, do these 5 steps. They had to invent a way to fly the airplane while they were already inside the emergency. And somehow, they got it all the way to an airport. They did not make a normal landing, they could not. But they got close enough that 185 people walked away from a situation later simulator tests showed was virtually impossible to control. The engine failure started the emergency, but the reason it became a disaster was hidden somewhere else, in 3 backup systems that could all be reached by the same failure. And when those systems disappeared, the pilots were left with 2 engines and whatever they could invent before the ground arrived. If you want to keep digging into stories like this with me, subscribe to Failure Atlas and tell me in the comments, do you think getting 185 people out alive counts as one of aviation's greatest emergency landings, even though the airplane crashed? Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.